We're live. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to be here. It's so good to be here with Dr. Alex again. And again, welcome to another essential conversation here at Wellbeings. And our conversation today is about mismatched desire in committed relationships. Such a struggle, when me and the doctor were discussing this topic, it was it's such a normal thing. It's there always in every other couple. This dynamic that shows up that sometimes you can't see it because it's so obvious. It's always there. It's always somehow in the midst of a struggle or a challenge in relationships. And so I'm really excited to talk about this today. And I had a conversation at the end of one of my groups yesterday with a man, and he says, "So he's going to talk about mismatched desire. Good luck with that," he said. He said, "There's nothing you can do. She either wants it or she doesn't want it." And he says, well, maybe we could start talking about communication.
Exactly. Yes.
Maybe there's something there. But let me hand this over to you, Doc. Is this, I suppose, but before we jump into understanding, how did you start to realize that this is a very common struggle that shows up in relationships?
Well, I've been doing sexual marital therapy for over 20 years, and the field of sexology does not do a very good job with this problem. And it's not just mismatched sexual desire. The number one sexual problem that Americans, people in the United States, report is what we call inhibited sexual desire or low sexual desire. And the number two problem is these discrepancies or mismatched sexual desire. So as you say, it's pervasive, and it happens with all kinds of couples and all kinds of age group. It doesn't mean if you're same sex or opposite sex. So being able to identify where you are in these positions in the system of a quote marriage. So marriage meaning two people that are in a committed relationship with each other. It doesn't have to be legal. Is really the first step. And also to think about how, people that have a sex life together in a coupleship, that sexuality can be anything from tension reducing to connecting to being a bonding experience or sharing pleasure. I mean, there are many reasons why people have sex with each other. And the misnomer is that healthy sex is always this sort of perfectly, connecting, beautiful sexual experience. And it's not. Sometimes it's because you want to go to sleep at night. But you have to have that connection first. Otherwise, one or both parties are going to feel used or taken advantage of. So the relationship is always the most important thing. And then sex comes out of the relationship. Sex is a way to have a positive, emotional commitment or with the other person. So that there's more, you could say, sort of social lubrication in the day-to-day activities, so that we argue less about who's picking up the kids or who didn't go get the groceries or just kind of the day-to-day stuff that bogs us down, that our sex and sexuality has us feeling more connected, kinder, more loving towards each other. So that's, kind of a general overview of this idea. And typically, people have to think about what's really true, what's going on. I mean, does sex feel more like work than play to you? Right? That would be one question. And do you think that touching always has to lead to orgasm? A lot of people avoid affection. They avoid cuddling. They avoid touch because they feel so pressured or squeamish that means they have to have intercourse or an orgasm. And do they only touch in the bedroom? So I would challenge people to think about, how affectionate am I with my partner? How much do I take their hand? How much do I put my arm around them? How much connection do we make in that way? Because touch is extremely pleasurable. The skin is the biggest organ in the body. When you think about it, it is the kind of main event. So if sex isn't giving you a feeling of attachment or sharing, or you don't look forward to it, or it's limited to a fixed time, or someone's dictating the way it gets done, or another common complaint is one person's always the initiator and the other person feels pressured. So these are some of the things to think about whether sex has become mechanical, or you would say your best sex was when you first met. So these are things to think about. If you've answered, yes, 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 like let's say to 4 or 5 or more of those questions, then likely you are in a low sex or no sex relationship.
And so like that, for our viewers who are watching and who are, there's like norms someone have, or ideals that people could have, or conditioning from society or from the culture that they're in, that says that after being in a relationship or being married for a while, that it like I have a men's group, and some men say, yeah, I have sex once or twice a year. It's just what happens when you're in a relationship for, and my wife wants it sometimes, and you know what, that's just what it is. And so I suppose the first step is, well, what would be the first? Is it them communicating with themselves? So if that's broken down, one would go to a therapist.
Well, look, the longer people avoid sex, the harder it is to break the cycle of avoiding it. And it really stresses a relationship when there is no sex in it. And that's when people start to go outside of the relationship. They start looking elsewhere. And so you want to find out whether the sexual problem is a symptom of the relationship, or is it the cause of the problems in the relationship. And so looking at patterns is really crucial to getting to the problem of this. So people will get angry, they'll act out their anger, and it becomes a vicious cycle, because if somebody stops initiating, the other person's angry. Then when they try to initiate, they're still angry at them because they feel like they haven't really been heard. And so anger is often a big problem. Then you get emotional distance and sexual distance, and then you get into this vicious cycle. So, another conflict people have is over frequency. They feel like sex is being demanded of them, and so the pleasure goes down, and there's no sexual anticipation or excitement about it. So my point is, people really have to look at what their patterns are and what got them into this, because if they don't understand the pattern, then they can't resolve the problem. And
yeah, so it's like they got to look at it. They can look at their own history, and they can look at what stage of the spectrum does the problem initiate, days before, when you're starting to think about it. Does it happen, a half an hour before? Does it happen in foreplay, or is there foreplay? Does it happen during the event, or does some shame or guilt happen after the event? So that it feels like it's such a massive, that's just where my mind went to there, Doc, when I thought about thinking about.
I would say, like, if people are in this place where they have no sexual desire, low sexual desire, if one of them or both can sit down and say, look, I really miss connecting with you that way, which is very different than blaming, right? And saying, I want to make a commitment to resolve this issue. And if the other person says, yeah, me too, that's the beginning of the conversation. So I don't think it's useful to go back and rehash who didn't do what and whose fault it is and all of that. If there are unresolved resentments, like something bad happened that was never processed, and something bad can be anything from a miscarriage that was never talked about, or one person handled it one way and the other person, sometimes males have a tendency to just avoid or disappear on that because it's so painful. They don't know how to have their feelings about it. And the female can feel abandoned, and that can lead to a longstanding resentment of not feeling cared for, not feeling understood. So the resentments have to be cleaned up. But going back and like just finding a new relationship is really not usually a good answer. And going back and digging through the bones of what happened and whose fault it is not useful either. So I really think people need to think about, what promotes healthy sex? What are the things that are going to make us want to be sexual with each other? So when people realize that sex is more than just about genitals and orgasm, that it involves your attitudes, your feelings, your experience, your sense of play with the person, that it's a source of rejuvenation as opposed to feelings of guilt and shame is important, and that it should be an integral part of your personality in a way that you connect with your body and enjoy pleasure states with someone else, so that it's a giving and receiving of pleasure-oriented touch. So not just about getting off. And that's where we're so organized towards performance and penetration, and
Yeah.
not around pleasure and how our sexuality can enhance our intimacy, our closeness, our friendship. Instead, it's about, we have to get to the finish line.
Yeah, and you remind me of. I'm back in Bali at the moment, which is wonderful. I'm also grieving the loss of leaving Ireland, which I really had such an amazing time, and
Mhm.
will be back there again. But what I met a little farmer on out in the countryside who was tending to his cows, and he was chatting. He says, "I seen you around there." He says, "What are you up to anyway?" And I told him what I was doing, and then I just said, "I do some podcasts. What are you doing?" And I told him, and then he watched one. And then the following week, he stopped me on the road. He says, "I want to chat to you about something, young fella." And he says, "I was watching that thing about love addiction." He says, "Very interesting indeed." Now he says, "Me and Mary had a chat about it," and he says there was a question that we both in their late 60s,
Mhm.
maybe 70s, and he says, "I kind of want it most of the time." He says, I just really want it. And she doesn't want it, but she's like slow to want to get into the mood. He says, "Is there anything I can do about it?" And I says, "Well, wonderful that you watched the video and you were talking about it. You have a question." But I suppose through that conversation with him, he was really saying that, and I'm imagining this maybe for many people, some people are spontaneous, where they can have that very easy access to arousal, and other people it takes work and like touch and sort of a journey to be able to help them get into that landscape.
Yeah, I think spontaneity is a real problem for long-term committed relationships. I think that that's a myth. And even, if somebody is 20 or in their 30s, maybe they have some spontaneity, but generally that's not how bodies work, especially when they're older like that. So there are authors here in the States, McCarthy and McCarthy, who've written quite a bit on sex and sexuality, and they talk about these 4 components of sexual functioning. And the first one is desire. Right? You have to have a positive anticipation that you deserve healthy sexuality and you desire to have it. And if your personal desire is shut down, your partner cannot jumpstart that or make you spontaneous. You've got to ask yourself, why don't I want sex? And why am I disconnected from my sexual body? And what is it about pleasure that I just shelved because I thought I was too old or I have shame about it? So that is a very big component. Where is my personal desire? And I think of that as a vitality state in the same way I desire to go to the beach in the summer, or maybe go horseback riding, or something that feels there's some velocity to it, there's excitement to it, whatever your hobby might be or thing that lights you up, to go dancing or listening to fun music with friends. There's an aliveness in desire. And then the other one is pleasure, about receptivity, and being responsive to sensual and sexual touching. And again, I don't think we think about sex as touch as much as we do penetration. So there's a lot of space between here and there. And a lot of people just want to jump to the orgasm and get it over with, because it's really just a release of tension, as opposed to the connection that it takes to slowly get to know yourself and your partner's body. And then there's eroticism. What subjectively arouses you, and how is that different than what arouses me? And people don't talk about that. They're too afraid. They're too ashamed. They're too hung up, because this idea that we're all the same is completely ridiculous. What turns one person on disgusts someone else, because human beings make meaning of the sexual act. Animals don't. The female goes into heat, the male mounts her, and they have sex. But when you line up human beings, there's so many different iterations of sex and sexuality that's only limited by our imagination. And then really satisfaction is the fourth one, is that, do you have good feelings about yourself as a sexual person, and emotionally and physically bonding with your partner? Does it feel good afterwards? Does it add to your well-being? Or are you just enduring it and getting it over with because you think it's your duty, or somebody's pressuring you? But the truth is, you really don't like the sex you're having, which is why you don't want to have sex. And I'll get into that in a minute also. So in part, what I'm talking about is people having realistic expectations about the body that they're in, the age that they're at, how flexible they can be with sexual experiences, and that no one's going to have an equal level of desire or arousal. It's rare that that happens in long-term relationships, but that doesn't mean that you can't have it. And people also think that long-term sexual desire is not based on romantic love the way it is in the beginning. It's just not. It's not on romance. It's not on passion. It's not on drama. It's on this deeper connection, this non-demanding pleasuring that I'm talking about. So if we can talk about that issue of spontaneity for a moment. There's a researcher in Canada named Peggy Kleinplatz, and she's written a book called Magnificent Sex. She's done a lot of research on this. And she says that spontaneity is ridiculous. It's a Hollywood construct, because when you're dating somebody, you think you're having spontaneous sex, but you're not, right? You have a date with them tonight. It's Saturday night, at least here in the States, right? And so you're thinking about, in the morning, I'm going to work out. I'm going to wash my hair. I'm going to go buy something new to wear. I'm going to clean up my apartment or my house. I'm going to plan this whole thing. I've planned the date where we're going to meet. Like, there's all this preparation that gets done. And then the doorbell rings, and there you are in your spontaneous, fabulous self. But you just spent hours putting yourself together. And how many people actually plan on having sex like that when they're in committed relationships? How many people show up in sort of dingy underwear or old clothes, or they're not really attending to their physical body? They're not putting in the effort to groom, shower, think about what they're wearing, how they're presenting themselves for yourself, because it feels good, it feels sensual for you, and that you are bringing yourself to your partner, as opposed to your partner should just want you in whatever bedraggled state you're in. So sex takes work. Great sex, from the research that's done at the University of Ottawa in Canada, what they found after interviewing thousands of people is that great lovers, magnificent lovers, all report that sex takes an inordinate amount of work, just like everything else in life. You don't have a beautiful garden unless you're out there every day tending to the weeds, tilling the soil, replanting. It's backbreaking work, but you get a beautiful garden. And if you don't attend to it, you get nothing. And sex and your sex life is exactly the same way. So that's the good news and the bad news.
Yeah. Wow. And then that's a lovely frame. And another conversation that happened this week was somebody in another group talked about, well, I am very energetic and my partner is very sensual. And then some groups as well, I'm into kink, and I'm this, and they're all starting to talk about the different sort of orientations, the different sort of things that get them aroused, get them pumping and pulsating with what I love that term, aliveness and enlivening, vitality, and this was powerful, because half the group had no idea what these people were talking about. to kink. What's that?
Right.
And what do you mean energetic? What do you mean exactly? What do you mean sensual?
That's
So
great.
there's,
Yeah.
and this was just, it was at the end of the group. It wasn't, this was just a real, and they were saying, okay, well, this is, I was observing that this was really interesting. And like, is this something which, again, through that umbrella of the work, is to really work out what it is that gets you going? What is it that brings you alive?
Yes, and to talk to your partner about it, because McCarthy talk about being an intimate team, that there's not a problem here. It's just how are we working together, as opposed to making each other the problem, right? How do we have conversations about and be curious about our differences and really talk to be understood, not to convince or pressure, and listen to understand, to be curious about what that is and what your partner's interested, and noticing your squeamishness or your judgment about it, as opposed to how do I bring this person who I say I love deeply pleasure? And if I bring that person pleasure by, putting a lampshade on my head and twirling around in circles, does that really cost me anything? I might feel self-conscious or like it's weird, but what is my self-consciousness about? Typically, it's about shame, that I think somebody's watching me or judging me. And what if they're not? And what if I'm just going to do that because, and we have to be careful here, because if it takes me out of my integrity, if it really leaves me feeling bad afterwards and gross and like I violated myself, I shouldn't do it. But if it's just that I'm a little embarrassed or squeamish, but I want to try it anyway, then I should do it because it's forcing me up against my own limitations. So that is, these are positions in a system. You usually have a high desire partner and a low desire partner. And the high desire partner is usually always pressuring the low desire partner for sex, right? They're the ones that are complaining about being rejected. They're the ones that buy all the books about sex. They're the ones that say to their partners, you should listen to Nigel's podcast with Alex on it, right? They're always bringing all these, resources and aids. They buy vibrators and sex toys and it all just piles up on the side of the bed of the low desire partner who's just dug in their heels, right? And so the person with lower desire avoids intimacy. That's what's happening. And higher desire claims that there's no reason to change and they blame the other person. And this is where people get into what David Snarch, a famous sexologist, used to call emotional gridlock, that nobody's going to budge now because they're making each other the problem instead of standing on the same side against the problem and working as an intimate team. So when people come into therapy and they have these problems, I'm usually disinterested in the story of who's terrible in bed and who's doing what to whom. What I'm interested in, and I would challenge all of us to think about, is what kind of sex life would you like to have? What is your vision for an ideal sex life? And it's an important question because it changes from the time you're 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. There's a different answer every decade as our bodies shift and change. So instead of blaming and shaming your partner, what if the two of you made a commitment that you're going to do some writing about what your ideal sex life would look like, and then you share that with each other and see how close or far apart that you are? So the low desire partner is still going to feel they're going to feel guilt and they're going to feel self-blame because they can't perform for the high desire partner. And that becomes a problem because, with blaming, there comes coercion. And that brings us to the matter of consent also. You cannot consent if you are, being coerced into doing something and you do it even though you don't want to. You're actually violating yourself. So,
Well, there's so many things as you're talking here, Doc, and this piece around it it kind of came up in a few weeks ago in a session with a client, and where there has been no sex. The low sex libido partner has just felt the parental controlling parent from the other, the tyrannical, demanding, shaming, guilting, to a stage where the woman was shut down and in a sort of passivity, locked away, like in a sort of hostile sort of retreat.
Yeah.
And in these situations, which I find I come across a lot more than I realized exists in the world, which is where there's absolutely no sex happening, and and they're staying together for and this is just the relationship that's there. It's practical. They do things. They take
Sure. Yeah.
and I suppose the question that I'm curious about, whether it's someone who's really retreated away from the partner because of the continual demand, or where both of them have given up completely in wanting to have sex, where it's, I suppose, at that other end of the spectrum, what would be the first thing that they would have to start to wonder about, or start to think about?
The continual demand, the coercion, the pressure to perform is part of the problem. And the person doing that doesn't realize that. And the low desire partner is acquiescing because they just want that person off their back and they want to avoid the partner's anger or conflict. But the high desire partner is maintaining the problem. And they have to see that first and foremost. And the low desire person really has to start talking and working through what's going on with them. And this is where they have to become this intimate team that I'm talking about, because avoidance just worsens the problem. It has people getting more hostile, more angry, more emotionally alienated. And it's not really one person's fault, actually. And a key word here is mutuality. These magnificent lovers in the Canadian study all said that there was a high level of mutuality. That's what made sex great, right? They didn't talk much about love. They didn't talk about sexual positions. They talked about things like communication, mutuality, having sex with a peer, being open, curious, interested, things of that nature. So that's really the first start is for people to talk about why they have, embodied these positions that they've had, and how do they start to invite, a conversation so that sex is comfortable, it's open, there is, it should be intimacy, sensuality, playfulness, those sorts of things. They have to be valued. Those qualities have to be valued by both parties. And so you cannot have this high desire partner has to adopt a non-demand approach. So meaning they've got to back way off. And when they back off, the low desire partner has to come forward and start talking about why they avoid what they avoid. I mean, I had a case once where I was seeing the male, and he was complaining about how his wife didn't want to have sex with him that often. And he was the high desire person, and he was really the one who was carrying the energy for change. And he eventually brought her in. And I had pictured her as this sort of, uptight, frigid, not very sexual woman. And I was surprised to see that she was quite beautiful and very sensual. And she said, I've always loved sex. But what ended up coming up is that she didn't like sex with him, because he was kind of an oaf when it came to being in bed with her. He was a big guy. He would lower all of his weight on top of her. She was formerly a dancer, so she was much more fluid and languid and sexual. And he was always sort of grabbing her body when they were not in bed in front of their teenage sons, which really angered her because she felt like it was, a little bit too vulgar, or it made her vulnerable in front of her sons. And the way he was grabbing her was inappropriate in front of them. So he was just kind of clueless about who she was, what she needed. He was not paying attention to her. And so she was just avoiding him. It wasn't because she didn't love him. It was because she wasn't actually honest with him and communicating to him about the kind of touch she wanted, the kind of sex she wanted. And that's what happens is people have to start to hear each other, and they have to start to value what each other's values are around sex and sexuality. So someone might say, you know, I like really this very light, sensual touch. And someone else might say, I'm into rough sex. Well, wow, we've got a pretty big divide there, don't we? So how can both parties start to listen and be curious with that and find a way to meet each other in the middle?
Yeah, well, the communication seems to be so essential in this regard.
Right.
We can't go anywhere new without it. And so I'm really curious about just ask about that session, that work that you did with that particular couple. You know, how did the man respond whenever his wife partner named it to him? Like, did he receive it or did he get defensive? Because I can imagine it's quite humbling, you know, for the viewers out there. You know, when we sit down and for partners to reveal to you that how you've been doing it for the last 30 years just hasn't really been, working.
So great. Yeah.
It hasn't been so great. So the little boys and the men, or the little girls and women, they can feel rejected or hurt or sad. But there's a maturing process that I imagine that needs to take place there, where we can bring our adults in and support that sort of feelings that arise when someone says, yes, it hasn't been working, and let's try something new. You know,
it's a great question. So I think this is about growing ourselves sexually and being adults, sexual adults. And most people learn about sex when they're teenagers or in their 20s, and they never update their scripts. And then they look at porn, which is very rote and rigid. There's no creativity in pornography. It's make-believe sex. And so they just kind of go through the motions of getting off. And so to have a beginner's mind to say, wow, I actually don't know anything about my partner's sexuality because I haven't been curious. I haven't been asking. And they don't know anything about mine because they didn't ask either. So it's nobody's fault. It's just here we are. We didn't know. So how do we practice self-compassion and compassion for each other? Because getting defensive means I'm getting hurt or I'm getting wounded, and I want to attack you for that. And if that's the route we're going to go, we're not going to get anywhere. We're going to keep backing each other off instead of saying, you know, it was hard for this guy to say, wow, that's really hard to hear that, right? And so we have to process what's hard about that. And, you know, the ways that they communicate these things to each other make a difference also. But the first step is really increasing awareness and not avoiding and talking about intimacy or touch or sexuality. So that's the very first step, just like the guys in your group started to talk about the kind of sex they like. It's like, exactly. Oh, I didn't know there were different kinds of sex. It's like saying to someone, you know, I love spaghetti and meatballs, and thinking everybody likes spaghetti and meatballs out of a can, right? When there's so many different flavors, and you can have it really spicy or sweet or, you know, large meatballs, small meatballs, different kinds of pasta. Like there are a million ways to make spaghetti and meatballs. And so to assume that your partner wants it the same way you want it is not being very curious about them. And you're not going to have the best meal together because it may be the difference between you making what you usually make, but you've got to add red pepper to their dish, right? Or a teaspoon of sugar to their dish. And then you can enjoy this fabulous meal together, even though it's slightly different.
So really, again, it's just there's so much things popping like fireworks as I'm hearing you talk, Doc. And there's this other thing that I'm imagining. So if you're this low libido part of the relationship and you are not having a voice, and a part of that not having a voice is maybe you're caretaking the other, not wanting to upset them or say anything. So they have to come forth and meet that sort of uncomfortability of vulnerability, regardless of how the other will respond, but spoken from a place of from the heart and being vulnerable and kind, and not blaming, as you said earlier. And I suppose the grandiose aspects of the high libido person, they have to somehow come out of that sort of demanding, sort of controlling. Control is a big word that I think can bring in whenever, that kind of coercion and manipulating. They have to come down to the other person's level in a way. And I suppose these dynamics of shifts are essential.
Yes, because they have to take an emotional problem-solving approach. It's not your problem or my problem. We have a problem. We have to stand on the same side against the problem. And so, the person that says, oh, I don't want to hurt your feelings, is like, well, you've been hurting their feelings for years. You dug in your heels, you stopped having sex, and you wouldn't talk about it. That's hurting somebody's feelings. You weren't honest with them. And the other person has been, bludgeoning by way of being demanding about sex and pleasure and feeling rejected. And if they say, you know what, I'm going to stop demanding this of you. I'm going to talk about what I want and need. I'm actually going to be honest with you about what's true for me. And then we're either going to come together or we're not. But being in this emotionally dug in place with all these resentments is just so awful. People live in miserable marriages to the day they die sometimes. So a part of what you're asking, Nigel, is that people have to not feel ashamed. They have to stop beating themselves up. They have to say, look, I did what I did. I didn't know any different. I love you. I want to connect with you. I just haven't known how. And I've been really angry. And I've been afraid to tell you because I was afraid you would leave. So instead, I just suffered in silence and had sex with you and hoped it would be over. Which is worse, leaving or doing that?
Yeah, and often it's not just in the bedroom that's happening. I would call that states of apathy, where it's a violent act towards the self.
Yes, that's right. I mean, a lot of women, kind of violate themselves or sort of maritally rape themselves because they have sex. They're not lubricated. They're not ready. They're not interested, and they just want it to be over. And then they resent their partners, as opposed to, you're doing this to yourself. Unless it's a really abusive relationship, and that's a different matter. But in most cases, it's not. So, the third step is that people have to approach each other again as a sexual friend, right? You're my sexual friend. You are not my enemy. You're not my worst critic. We're in this together. And that starts to change the dynamic naturally with that. And then people have to be honest about what they value about intimacy. Is it affection? Is it touch? Is it just really just sex? Is there playfulness? Is there the kind of eroticism you were talking about, where people want to experiment with things or try different things to figure out what their arousal is? They might not even know. You can ask a bunch of people what their sexual fantasies are, and they'll say they don't know. So that person, all of us have to take responsibility for our sexuality. We can't expect our partners to be mind readers, or that if they're mind reading, they're going to say, well, I'm just going to go with what my sexual style is and just trust you're going to like it because you're not telling me what you like. It's like saying, what do you want for lunch? I don't know. All right, well, I'm going to make some weird concoction of, chicken livers and something else and just hope you like it.
Yeah, so it's like, a lot of the time, I suppose one of the reasons, why I'm really passionate about having these particular type of conversations, and especially with you, Doctor, is that over the 16 years of working with clients, often the struggle that I see that is presented, whatever is being presented, it also shows up in the bedroom. There's always some sort of dynamic that and it's so not talked about in a lot of different psychologies where it's actually being addressed. It's often being avoided because of the therapist's own sort of inadequacies or struggles in that department. And I hope it doesn't come across as a judgment. It's just something that I've sort of acknowledged, and through this sort of sharing, it's really helping a lot of the guys and women that I work with. And And one of the things that popped up that was important, and you kind of touched on it a bit, and it's, like when there is no communication anywhere, or when there is a sort of demanding in another part of the relationship where or where there's a distance, or where there's, what was the example that was given, where there was a lot of duress and struggle around finances, and nobody was talking about what was going on, and there was this held tension, and it was also in the bedroom, and it was also, and the person's inability to talk to the partner was also reflected in that they weren't able to talk to anybody. They didn't even talk to the girls about. So it is in the bedroom. But so what I was really saying here is that this can really start to change your life, because,
of course, right,
and it's not just in the bedroom, but how it can really touch all aspects of how you are with you, and how you are with the other, and how you can bring yourself towards the world. As you talked about that vitality, which is what I really feel therapy is all about, is about how you can look at what blocks the vitality in the individual's life. So would you agree that it has that potential to really change a person's whole way of being?
100%. I mean, people can tell me how they argue in the kitchen on any given day, or who initiates sex and how they have sex, and I can tell you what the other thing looks like. So when people tell me what's going on sexually, I know what the dynamic in their relationship is. And if I know what the dynamic in their relationship is, I know exactly how they're having sex, because it plays out, as you say, across the board. These are passive moves, aggressive moves, codependent moves, you name it. And that's why it's not enough for the high desire person to just back off, to stop. The low desire person has to start to confront all of their attitudes about sex and sexuality and intimacy, so that people start to have a balance between sharing their lives and their autonomy, right? And it's interesting because we tolerate differences when it comes to food and hobbies and travel and what else, just how we dress. We tolerate all sorts of differences with each other, but we don't really get that interested in the differences in each other sexually and tolerate those things. It's like we're supposed to be exactly the same somehow. Or if you want to do something and I don't, then you're perverted. But I grab the moral high ground, and I'm righteous about it. And it's like, well, who says?
Yeah, and I see again what you're just saying is, macrocosms here, where the state of where we're at right now in the world is such a polarization, and yet enough spaces and places to help people to grow regard for one another in their polarized view, or their indifference, or the way in which they see it. They have the right to have that different view, as do you. And how can I regard them and have great regard for their right to having that belief or that orientation? And it's the same in the bedroom. Like, okay, so you want to jump out the window or swing from the chandeliers in the bedroom, and I want to be tied up and stay in the cupboard. How can we work that out? How can we do that?
Right.
And it's about regard for one another.
Well, one of the ways too, I mean, I love what you're saying, because when we first get together with somebody, we realize, like, wow, our differences are really enriching us, right? We're expanding possibilities, because you've got all these interests over there I don't know anything about that I want to learn about. And I have things you don't know about, you want to learn about. So we're making our circle of friends, experiences, intellectual conversations richer and better, but not with sex. We don't want to do that with sex, right? And so to be able to state your feelings and make requests and emotionally problem solve is what is required in the sexual arena also. And this is why I say this is about an adult sexuality, because you've really got to be a grown-up about this and watch where you get threatened and where you get triggered and where you get judgmental, and realize is that those are places for you to grow. It's not about shutting it down and you just have to live with my sexual limitations, because then you get into this stale, place that we were talking about, this sort of death of sex.
Yeah, this sort of, especially for the low sex libido people is sort of like a dull safety that promotes a real unfulfillment, you know.
Yes. So if we say, you know what, we have desire discrepancies, we accept that between ourselves. We also have differences in what we like to do recreationally, and that's okay. So people don't want to fall into this guilt, shame, coercion, blaming trap. I'll give you an example. My husband loves to mountain bike, and he loves to uphill mountain bike. And when I met him, I just said, I won't be doing that. I love to do Pilates and yoga, and I work out. I'm fairly athletic and active, but I don't have the stamina for that. My body's not built for that. And he never expected that I would do that. And so he mountain bikes pretty much every Sunday morning for a couple hours. I'm so happy for him because he loves it. He feels great. He's in a good mood when he gets home. I would never want him to not do that, nor would he ever coerce me or guilt me or shame me for not doing it with him. And that is just, I think, a very clear example of what we're talking about when it comes to sex and sexuality. But the person that wants to jump out of the window, it's like, you know what? I can't jump. I might hurt myself, but I'll watch. I'll clap from the sidelines as long as you've got a good bungee cord or a trampoline down there and you're not going to hurt yourself. But I will bear witness to that. I will hold you. I'll be with you because you enjoy it so much.
Yeah, it's such a powerful thing, is what you're saying. And I think it's a big thing to do with intimacy per se, which is we can be close and we can be together, but also we can be individuated. And in that individuation, I like this and you like that, and let's support each other to see how we can do this by being not needing to be codependent, is what I mean, in the closeness, you know, and having to please the other. So this goes to the men and the women out there who are listening, who thinks that to create security that you learned in your childhood, when you didn't have anybody telling you that part of a normal life is a successful life is insecurity, that security comes by avoiding things or caretaking the other and having to, you know, base security as in like changing yourself to suit the environment, that doesn't need to happen in the bedroom, and that you can have a differentiated view on what really fills you up and nourishes your soul and your heart and where you come alive, you know. And is this something that you see that happens with one of the possibly, I'm imagining, the lower libido person could take on this characteristic, where they would be that little bit, have overly pleased for a long time, collected stamps, of course, and then eventually had enough stamps collected of resentment was growing, and then they pulled away.
Yes, I mean, that's quite possible. But I want to be careful here that the low desire partner not be pathologized. The high desire partner is as unwell as the low desire partner. And so I think when people start to expand their perspective of what sex is and sexuality, and they move it into intimate conversations, touch, sensuality, then they've got a much broader palette to work with. And it's not about constantly, as you're saying, tracking your partner and pleasing them until you're in a corner and you're so enraged at them, but really you're enraged at yourself because you keep accommodating in order to please. You're going along to get along, that you're angry at yourself. And then people say, I don't even know who I am, or I lose myself in relationships. That's your doing. You keep giving up ground and giving up ground and giving up ground and don't say anything about it. And then you're angry about it. And so, of course, you don't want to have sex. You've been violating yourself all along. And then, you know, typically the higher desire partner is going to get more coercive also, put more pressure on, because, you know, people get loud when they feel like they're not being heard.
Exactly. Yeah, well, it reminds me of a client I had one time, and we were talking. It was in a group format, and she says, "I'm really in love with my partner," and we were saying, "What is that?" And she says, "Well, you know, I do everything for him. It feels so good. You know, I arrange his hairdressing appointments. I make sure that I buy that nice shirt that I know that he likes and the right size. And I look around after we have sex to make sure that he has really fulfilled. And I listen tentatively to what what he wants, and then at the end of the 12-week cycle, the woman starts to talk about wanting to leave the relationship after realizing that she was getting resentful and kind of annoyed at this sort of focusing outside of herself for the pleasure.
Well, I think people have to agree to a mutual level of intimacy, right? That's between the couple. So some people have this soulmate style where they're just super close all the time. Other people have more of a complementary autonomy in the way that you're talking about, they've got moderate closeness. Some people have super strong personal boundaries. So you have to decide what kind of couple you are and what works for you and what's true for you. Some people have like a lot of emotional expression and they've got periods of great closeness and then periods of distance. And so it's got to be, again, there's got to be a mutuality with that. And I can tell you there's a distinct sort of pattern in my own relationship that I'm very aware of that a lot of people could not hang with. We're both super busy people. There are times when both of us kind of have to go in the woodshed. You can't write books or run a business or do things and be just lovey-dovey and everything's fun and we're just having a good time all the time. Sometimes we really burrow down into our work, but it's because we have a strong emotional connection and a deep bond and secure functioning, that meaning we agree to our commitments and we keep them, that we can go away and come back together and nobody feels resentful or hurt. I mean, we might miss each other. It might be like, wow, this is a really hard period right now because we're, launching some new business or program or something like that. But it doesn't mean that one person just drifts out of the relationship. And again, a lot of people could not handle that. Somebody else might want like an enormous amount of closeness with the other person, and that's okay. Just be clear about what your style is and which one of these configurations are true for you and what you need. And don't get involved in a relationship with someone. Like if I were super a homebody and super wanting to be close and needy in that way, my husband would not be a good partner for me because he's very independent. And he actually needs someone who can hang with that independence, who's independent also. But that doesn't mean avoidant or, again, taking off in some way.
I think the difference there is the fact that you have that strong emotional bond that you can. It's
That's
not
right.
about being joined at the hip. It's about when you are together that there's this wonderful communication and where the intimacy is formed, not on and it's potent and it's vulnerable and it's real.
Right.
I think that secures that. I lean towards that type of relationship with my wife as well. It's like that's what's important for me. It's about the quality of the vulnerability. Today I cried in the arms with my wife. I let her see my little one inside who was feeling overwhelmed, and some would say that that's not sexy. But if you asked her, she would feel that it's sensual, it's close, it's like she feels I'm there, and this and it has it oozes a sort of sensuality. But yeah, and I think that for me is a place where I'm very much that. I need the emotionality. I couldn't be in a relationship where that wasn't there.
I think that's true for most men. They're just afraid to show that because they're afraid that their vulnerability gets equated with weakness. And if they couldn't be vulnerable growing up, it was dangerous, especially if they had a mother that was not there or alcoholic or, critical, then it feels unsafe. But to your point, sexuality is only one way to express intimacy. That's a deeply intimate moment. And that forms the core of sexuality, that emotional intimacy, because sex is not by any means the sole way of expressing these things with each other. So just like you said, cuddling on the couch, lying in bed together, disclosing your fears, crying in each other's arms, that creates trust and respect. so that when you get into the bedroom and somebody wants to jump out of the window, it's okay. It's like, you're a nut. I love you, but let's try it.
Yeah, let's do
Right?
it. Yeah, I love these terms that I'm hearing. Is sort of, I love this. The thing is, one of the things that stands out, I think I don't know if it came from McCarthy, but just this intimate team.
That's their term, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a beautifully illustrative term, that we're not blaming and shaming each other. We're on the same side. We're curious. We're going to get into conversation. We're going to get into non-demanding pleasure that's sensual. So all kinds of pleasure-oriented touch, cuddling, kissing, massage, touching while clothed or semi-clothed, and that touching is valued in and of itself. And so for couples that haven't had sex for a long time, that are going to decide that they are going to grow themselves up sexually and have an adult sexuality and discover what that is with their intimate partner, that is the place to start, is with intimate touch, consensual touch. Where can I touch you? Where can't I touch you? And to slowly start to thaw out and to see, all the feelings that come up with that. Because part of how people avoid intimacy is that they just lunge at intercourse. Like, let's hurry up and get it over with so we don't have to deal with each other. But you ask people to slow things down in this way, and all of their issues and fears come up because it feels awkward or uncomfortable, or they're self-conscious. And that's where we need to be if we're really going to heal.
Yeah, that's the good stuff right there, and we can talk about what feels awkward or challenging or anxious or tension or what is that heat that's building up inside at that moment? What is that? I love that other term, emotional gridlock. I think start to allow the flow of traffic to start to
flow again. Yes.
Yeah, to flow again when you allow the slowing down and the touch and the communication, and you really tend to your garden then when you start to do that.
Right. And I want to say to people, this is not a pretty process. There's nothing about this that feels sexy or hot in the way that it gets advertised to us. It is deeply raw and intimate and close in. And being knowing yourself in ways you've not known yourself before. And, David White has this beautiful saying in his poetry, or just in his saying, that we're always meeting the stranger within. And that saying is so powerful to me. It's like, coming around the bend and there you are, and you didn't know that part of yourself. And you can only know it when you unzip like this emotionally, when you really make yourself naked to yourself and your partner, not physically, but emotionally. Then you start to see, and I believe that's where deep eroticism comes from, is that carnal abyss, that primitive sense of self that we can only touch during sex. But if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel like that person respects you, forget it. Nobody's going to go there, nor should they, actually. So oftentimes, no sex or bad sex is just a example of good judgment, right? Like, if you're having crummy sex, I don't blame you for not having sex. Like, who would want that kind of sex? Sounds boring and awful, and good for you for not doing it. So there's a plus there. But what kind of sex do you want to have? And are you just going to give up on yourself? When, by the way, the people in this study, the modal age was 50 years old. Most of the people were in their 50s, 60s, and into their 70s in this study. They were the ones that identified as magnificent lovers, because they'd given up all their insecurities and their self-consciousness and what other people think. All of that was just kind of out the window. They didn't care at that point. They knew they had cellulite and bad backs and erectile dysfunction, and they didn't care, right? And we can really take a lesson from that it wasn't about that. It was about this mutuality, this connecting, this redefining sex and sexuality. And there were high levels of play to this also. So playful touch, both genital and non-genital touching, like taking a bath together or showering together or dancing together, playing favorite music, whole body massages. All of these things are a bridge to sexual desire. And sexual desire comes from anticipation. I'm looking forward to being with you, not I'm dreading being with you, or God, I got to get this over with. And that may mean that you don't have sex that often, but when you're having it, it's really fun and great and satisfying and connecting.
Yeah, I remember one of my Ananda Mai, I think it was Ananda Mai, old spiritual lady from India, and I remember that she had sex once in her life, and it lasted throughout her life. She exploded.
Mm.
She read that wave of bliss, and her partner became her devotee, and the rest is history. But I
Yeah.
remember reading that. I found it hard to comprehend at the beginning, but for me now, it's not that sex happens all the time. It's about trying to develop that intimacy and that create that space, put in that effort. And again, for people out there, there's effort involved here. There's time, there's communication, this beautiful word called mutuality, where there's two people here, and we need that. We need that to do anything well. And based on the study and your experience, Doc, you can't do anything really well without that sort of partnership, that intimate team, that
Right.
curious to explore and understand themselves and the other, and to build that bridge of intimacy.
Yeah, and to stop making your partner your enemy or your critic.
That's
Yeah,
powerful.
stop hurting each other, really.
Well, Doug, just as we're coming to the end here, we've covered so many things in relation to how to face head on, sort of mismatched desire, and to start to, for the viewers out there, to really, sit down, take some notes, and then talk to your partner. Start with that. If you're someone who wants it a lot, come and talk. Like, slow it down. If you're someone who's not communicating and just feeling sex has just been so terrible that you've been avoiding it, then go and tell your partner what it is that you do want, or what you do like. And if you feel that that's really hard to do, then please speak to a specialist. Speak to somebody. Reach out to the doc. Reach out to anyone in your area if there's apart from a psychotherapist and counselors, and some of them may not have the specialization, what sort of other certifications that you would recommend for anyone? Patrick Kearns' work, he comes very heavily, or is it, what other schools would you recommend for someone to?
Well, I think to your point, there are studies that show that therapists who have gone through training and talking about sex and sexuality are much more apt to bring it up in their couple session than those who don't. So therapists can feel uncomfortable with it. So finding a sex coach. I have a colleague, Patty Britton, who's got an organization called Sex Coach University, and she certifies sex coaches all over the world. So whatever part of the world you're in, if you go to Sex Coach U, I think it's sexcoachu.com, you can find a sex coach somewhere, whether it's, Germany or Australia or Poland, you name it. And then also finding some people that are sex therapists that are not afraid to have these conversations with you. But I want to offer too that a starting point is just sitting down with your partner saying, I'm really scared to say this right now, or I feel so awkward talking about this. Just start with where you're at. You're not going to be able to get from A to Z in 1 minute. Just break the ice and say, this is really challenging. And maybe you cry. Maybe you just say, I'm really angry and I haven't known how to tell you. Just be in the moment with what's true for you. And that is the beginning of starting to be an intimate team with each other, to really listen and hear each other, so that you can start to have these difficult conversations.
Yeah, beautiful. And yeah, so I'm welcoming everybody who has any struggles in this department. And I haven't found so many people who don't have some struggle in this area called intimacy. It's an ongoing, as you used the analogy earlier, Doc, the garden, you have to keep pulling the weeds out. You have to keep tending to the garden. You have to keep cutting, and the same it is in relation to intimacy. So if anybody who would like to continue to deepen that and grow your vitality, start that conversation with the person who matters to you.
Right. And you can also find therapists at centerforhealthysex.com. We're available to work with you also through telehealth. Zoom is typically the platform, but we see plenty of people from all over the world to talk about sex and sexuality. Our URL is centerforhealthysex.com. We have intake counselors that can talk to you, and we can do therapy via telehealth all over the world.
Okay. Amazing. Okay, everybody, be well. Be healthy, and start that conversation to grow more vitality in your intimate world. Thank you again for tuning in, and if you got something from today, please hit a like or a share. It really helps reach more of our audiences. And Doctor, thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel.
Thank you so much. Be well.